Chapter 6 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office. Chapter 6, A Study in Finance. He that maketh haste to be rich shall not be innocent. Proverbs 28, verse 20. The victim of moral overstrain is the central figure in many novels and countless magazine stories. In most of them, he finally repents him fully of his sins past and returns to his former or to some equally desirable position, to lead a new and better life. The dangers and temptations of the street are, however, too real and terrible to be studied other than in actuality, and the fall of hundreds of previously honest young men owing to easily remedied conditions should teach its lesson, not only to their comrades but to their employers as well. The ball and chain, quite as often as repentance and forgiveness, ends their experience. No young man takes a position in a banking house with the deliberate intention of becoming an embezzler. He knows precisely, as well as does the reader, that if he listens to the whisper of temptation he is lost, and so does his employer. Yet the employer, who would hold himself remiss if he allowed his little boy to have the run of the jam closet, and then discovered that the latter's lips bore evidence of petty larceny, or would regard himself as almost criminally negligent if he placed a priceless pearl necklace where an ignorant chimney sweep might fall under the hypnotism of its shimmer, will calmly allow a condition of things in his own brokerage or banking office, where a $15 a week clerk may have free access to $1 million worth of negotiable securities, and even encourage the latter by occasional sure tips to take a flyer in the market. It is a deplorable fact that the officers of certain companies occasionally unload undesirable securities upon their employees, and in order to boom or create a movement in a certain stock, will induce the persons under their control to purchase it. It would be a rare case in which a clerk who valued his situation would refuse to take a few shares in an enterprise which the head of the firm was fathering. Of course, such occurrences are the exceptions, but there are plenty of houses not far from Wall Street where the partners know that their clerks and messengers are playing the market, and exert not the slightest influence to stop them. When these men find that they and their customers, and not the clerks and messengers, are paying the loss accounts of the latter, they are very much distressed, and tell the district attorney, with regret, that only by sending such wicked and treacherous persons to state's prison can similar dishonesty be prevented. Not long ago, the writer became acquainted with a young man who, as loan clerk in a trust company, had misappropriated a large amount of securities, and had pled guilty to the crime of grand larceny in the first degree. He was awaiting sentence, and in connection therewith, it became necessary to examine into the conditions prevailing generally in the financial district. His story is already public property, for the case attracted wide attention in the daily press. But inasmuch as the writer's object is to point a moral rather than adorn a tale, the culprit's name and the name of the company with which he was connected need not be given. He is now serving a term in state's prison and is, the writer believes, sincerely repentant, and determined to make a man of himself upon his release. For present purposes, let him be called John Smith. He was born in New York City, in surroundings rather better than the average. His family were persons of good education, and his home was a comfortable and happy one. From childhood he received thorough religious instruction, and was always a straightforward, honest, and obedient boy. His father, having concluded from observation that the shortest route to success lay in financial enterprise, secured a place in a broker's office for his son after the latter's graduation from the high school. John began at the bottom and gradually worked up to the position of assistant loan clerk in a big trust company. This took 15 years of hard work. From the day that he started in filling inkwells and cleaning out ticker baskets, he saw fortunes made and lost in a twinkling. He learned that the chief business of a broker is acting as go-between for persons who are trying to sell what they do not own to others who do not have the money to pay for what they buy. And he saw hundreds of such persons grow rich on these fictitious transactions. He also saw others wiped out, but they cheerfully went through bankruptcy and began again, many of them achieving wealth on their second or third attempt. He was earning $5 a week and getting his lunch at a vegetarian health restaurant for 15 cents. The broker, for whom he ran errands, gave away 35-cent cigars to his customers and had an elaborate luncheon served in the office daily, to a dozen or more of the elect. John knew one boy of about his own age who, having made a successful turn, began as a trader and cleaned up $100,000 in a rising market the first year. That was better than the cleaning up John was used to, but he was a sensible boy and had made up his mind to succeed in a legitimate fashion. Gradually he saved a few $100s and, acting on the knowledge he had gained in his business, bought 2 or 3 shares in a security which quickly advanced in value and almost doubled his money. The next time as well fortune favored him, and he soon had a comfortable nest egg, enough to warrant his feeling reasonably secure in the event of accident or sickness. He had worked faithfully, had given great satisfaction to his employers, and presently had a clerical position in a prominent trust company offered to him. It seemed an advance. The salary was larger, even if absurdly small, and he gladly accepted the place. Shortly after this he had his first experience in real finance. The president of the company sent for him. The reader will remember that this is a true story, and the boy entered his private office and came into the august presence of the magnate. This man is today what is commonly known as a power in Wall Street. "My boy," said the president, "you have been doing very well. I have noticed the excellence of your work. I want to commend you." "Thank you, sir," said John modestly, expecting to hear that his salary was to be raised. "Yes," continued the great man, "and I want you to have an interest in the business." The blood rushed to John's head and face. "Thank you very much," he gasped. "I have allotted you 5 shares in the trust company," said the president. "If you take them up and carry them, you will feel that you have a real connection with the house, and it will net you a handsome return. Have you any money?" It so happened that at this time John's savings were invested in a few bonds of an old and conservatively managed railroad. His heart fell. He didn't want to buy any bank stock. "No," he answered. "My salary is small enough, and I need it all. I don't save any money." "Oh well," said the magnate, "I will try and fix it up for you. I will arrange for a loan with the bank on the stock. Remember, I'm doing this to help you. That is all. You may go back to your books." Next day John was informed that he had bought 5 shares of Trust Company stock in the neighborhood of 300, and he signed a note for $1,425 and endorsed the stock over to the bank from which the money had been borrowed for him. The stock almost immediately dropped over 50 points. John paid the interest on the note out of his salary, and the dividends, as fast as they were declared, went to extinguish the body of the loan. Some time afterward he learned that he had bought the stock from the magnate himself. He never received any benefit from it, for the stock was sold to cover the note, and John was obliged to make up the difference. He also discovered that 10 or 15 other employees had been given a similar opportunity by their generous employer at about the same time. John, in prison, says it was a scheme to keep 50 or 100 shares where it could easily be controlled by the president without risk to himself, in case of need. Of course, he may be wrong. At any rate, he feels bitterly now toward the big men who are at large while he is in jail. John continued to keep up with the acquaintances formed during his years in the broker's office, many of whom had started little businesses of their own and had done well. Part of their stock in trade was to appear prosperous, and they took John out to lunch and told him what a fine fellow he was and gave him sure tips. But John had grown wise. He had had all the chances of that sort he wanted, and from a bigger man than any of them. He ate their lunches and invited them in return. Then he economized for a day or two to even up. He was not prosperous himself, but he did not accept favors without repaying them. One thing he observed and noted carefully. Every man he knew who had begun a brokerage business and kept sober, who attended to business and did not speculate, made money and plenty of it. He knew one young firm which cleared up $15,000 in commissions at the end of the second year. That looked good to him, and he knew besides that he was sober and attended to business. He made inquiries and learned that one could start in, if one were modest in one's pretensions, for $2,500. That would pay office rent and keep things going until the commissions began to come in. He started to look around for some other young man who could put up the money in consideration of John's contributing the experience. But all the men he knew had experience without money. Then, by chance, he met a young fellow of bright and agreeable personality, whom we shall call Prescott. The latter was 5 or 6 years older than John, had had a large experience in brokerage houses in another city, and had come to New York to promote the interests of a certain copper company. John had progressed and was now assistant loan clerk of one of the biggest trust companies in the city, which also happened to be the transfer agent for the copper company. Thus, John had constantly to handle its certificates. Prescott said it was a wonderful thing, that some of the keenest men in the street were in it, and although it was a curb stock, strongly advised his new friend to buy all he could of it. He assured John that, although he was admittedly interested in booming the stock, he was confident that before long it would sell at 4 times its present quotation. Meantime, the stock, which had been listed at 2 1/4, began to go rapidly up. Word went around the trust company that it was a great purchase anywhere below 10, and John, as well as the other boys employed in the company, got together what money he could and began to buy it. It continued to go up. They had unconsciously assisted in its ascent, and they bought more. John purchased 75 shares, all the way up to 8 and 9. One of his friends took 800. Then it dropped out of sight. They hadn't time to get out, and John in prison has his yet. But he still had faith in Prescott, for he liked him and believed in his business capacity. The stock operation over, Prescott began to prospect for something new, and suggested to John that they form a brokerage house under the latter's name. John was to be president at a fixed salary. It sounded very grand. His duties at the trust company began to seem picayune. Moreover, his loss in copper had depressed him, and he wanted to recoup if he could. But how to get the $2,500 necessary to start in business? Prescott pleaded poverty, yet talked constantly of the ease with which a fortune might be made if they could only once get in right. It was a period of increased dividends, of stock jobbing operations of enormous magnitude, of 50-point movements, when the lucky purchaser of only 100 shares of some inconspicuous railroad sometimes found that he could sell out next week with $5,000 profit. The air seemed full of money. It appeared to rain banknotes and stock certificates. In the loan cage at the trust company, John handled daily millions in securities, a great part of which were negotiable. When almost everybody was so rich, he wondered why anyone remained poor. 2 or 3 men of his own age gave up their jobs in other concerns and became traders, while another opened an office of his own. John was told that they had acted on good information, had bought a few hundred shares of Union Pacific, and were now comfortably fixed. He would have been glad to buy, but copper had left him without anything to buy with. One day Prescott took him out to lunch and confided to him that one of the big speculators had tipped him off to buy cotton, since there was going to be a failure in the crop. It was practically a sure thing. $2,000 margin would buy enough cotton to start them in business, even if the rise was only a very small one. "Why don't you borrow a couple of bonds?" asked Prescott. "Borrow from whom?" inquired John. "Why, from some customer of the trust company." "No one would lend them to me," answered John. "Well, borrow them anyhow. They would never know about it, and you could put them back as soon as we closed the account," suggested Prescott. John was shocked and said so. "You are easy," said his comrade. "Don't you know that the trust companies do it themselves all the time? The presidents of the railroads use the holdings of their companies as collateral. Even the banks use their deposits for trading. Didn't old blank dump a lot of rotten stuff on you? Why don't you get even? Let me tell you something. Fully 1/2 of the men who are now successful financiers got their start by putting up as margin securities deposited with them. No one ever knew the difference, and now they are on their feet. If you took 2 bonds overnight, you might put them back in the morning. Everyone does it. It's part of the game." "But suppose we lost?" asked John. "You can't," said Prescott. "Cotton is sure to go up. It's throwing away the chance of your life." John said he couldn't do such a thing. But when he returned to the office, the cashier told him that a merger had been planned between their company and another, a larger one. John knew what that meant well enough. Half the clerks would lose their positions. He was getting $35 a week, had married a young wife, and, as he had told the magnate, he needed it all. That night, as he put the securities from the loan cage back in the vault, the bonds burned his fingers. They were lying around loose, no good to anybody, and only 2 of them, overnight maybe, would make him independent of salaries and mergers, a free man and his own master. The vault was in the basement, just below the loan cage. It was some 20 feet long and 10 wide. There were 3 tiers of boxes with double combination doors. In the extreme left-hand corner was the loan box. Near it were 2 other boxes in which the securities of certain customers on deposit were kept. John had individual access to the loan box and the two others, one of which contained the collateral which secured loans that were practically permanent. He thus had within his control negotiable bonds of over $1 million in value. The securities were in piles, strapped with rubber bands, and bore slips on which were written the names of the owners. Every morning John carried up all these piles to the loan cage, except the securities on deposit. At the end of the day he carried all back himself and tossed them into the boxes. When the interest coupons on the deposited bonds had to be cut, he carried these also upstairs. At night the vault was secured by two doors, one with a combination lock and the other with a time lock. It was as safe as human ingenuity could make it. By day it had only a steel wire gate which could be opened with a key. No attendant was stationed at the door. If John wanted to get in, all he had to do was ask the person who had the key to open it. The reason John had the combination to these different boxes was in order to save the loan clerk the trouble of going downstairs to get the collateral himself. Next day, when John went out to lunch, he put two bonds belonging to a customer in his pocket. He did not intend to steal them, or even to borrow them. It was done almost automatically. His will seemed subjugated to the idea that they were to all intents and purposes his bonds to do as he liked with. He wanted the feeling of bonds in his pocket. As he walked along the street to the restaurant, it seemed quite natural that they should be there. They were nearly as safe with him as lying around loose in the cage, or chucked into a box in the vault. Prescott joined him, full of his new idea that cotton was going to jump overnight. "If you only had a couple of bonds," he sighed. Then, somehow, John's legs and arms grew weak. He seemed to disintegrate internally. He tried to pull himself together, but he had lost control of his muscles. He became a dual personality. His own John heard Prescott's John say quite naturally, "I can let you have two bonds, but mind we get them back tomorrow, or anyhow the day after." John's John felt the other John slip the two American Navigation 4s under the table, and Prescott's fingers close upon them. Then came a period of hypnotic paralysis. The flywheel of his willpower hung on a dead center. Almost instantly he became himself again. "Give 'em back," he whispered hoarsely. "I don't mean you should keep them," and he reached anxiously across the table. But Prescott was on his feet, halfway toward the door. "Don't be a fool, Smith," he laughed. "What's the matter with you? It's a cinch. Go back and forget it." He shot out of the door and down the street. John followed, dazed and trembling with horror at what he had done. He went back to the cage and remained the rest of the day in terror lest the broker who owned the two bonds should pay off his loan. But at the same time he had quickly made up his mind what he should do in that event. There was more than one loan secured by American Navigation 4s. He loosened a couple in one of the other piles. If the first broker came in, he would take two bonds from one of these. But the broker did not come in. That night John wandered the streets until nearly daylight. He saw himself arrested, ruined, in prison. Utterly fagged the next morning, he called up Prescott on the telephone and begged him to return the bonds. Prescott laughed at his fears and assured him that everything was all right. Cotton was sure to go up. An hour later, the broker who owned the bonds came in and took up his loan, and John removed two American Navigation 4s from another bundle and handed them to the loan clerk. Of course, the numbers on the bonds were not the same, but few persons would notice a little thing like that, even if they kept a record of it. They had the bonds, that was the main thing. Once more, John rushed to the phone, told Prescott what had occurred, and besought him for the bonds. "It's too late now," growled Prescott. "Cotton has gone down. I could only get one back at the most. We'd better stand pat and get out on the next bulge." John was by this time almost hysterical. Perspiration broke out on his forehead every now and then, and he shuddered as he counted his securities and entered up his figures. If cotton should go down some more, that was the hideous possibility. They would have to put up more margins, and then... Down in the vault, where the depositors' bonds were kept, were two piles of Overland 4s. One contained about 200, and the other nearly 600 bonds. The par value of these negotiable securities alone was nearly $800,000. Twice a year, John cut the coupons off of them. Each pile was marked with the owner's name. They were never called for, and it appeared that these customers intended to keep them there permanently. John, realizing that the chances of detection were smaller, removed two bonds from the pile of 200 Overlands and substituted them with Prescott for the two Navigation 4s. Then cotton went down with a slump. Prescott did not wait even to telephone. He came himself to the trust company and told John they needed 2 more bonds for additional margin to protect their loan. But he said it was merely temporary and that they had better even up by buying some more cotton. John went down into the vault and came back with 4 more Overland 4's bonds under his coat. He was in for it now, and might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb. He was beginning to get used to the idea of being a thief. He was, to be sure, wretchedly unhappy, but he was experiencing the excitement of trying to dodge fate until fortune looked his way. Cotton still went down. It never occurred to him that Prescott perhaps had not bought all the cotton. Now that he is in prison, he thinks maybe Prescott didn't. But he kept going down into the vault and bringing up more bonds, and getting reckless, bought more cotton, quantities of it. In a month, 60 bonds were gone from the pile of 200. John, a nervous wreck, almost laughed grimly at the joke of his being short 60 bonds. At home, they thought he was getting run down. His wife, he was so kind and thoughtful that she had never been so happy. It made her fearful that he had some fatal disease and knew he was going to die. Up at the bank, John made a separate bundle of 60 bonds out of the pile of 600, so that he could substitute them for those first taken if the owner called for them. It was not likely that both owners would call for their bonds on the same day, so that he was practically safe until one or the other had withdrawn his deposit. About this time, the special accountants came around to make their annual investigation. It was apparently done in the regular and usual way. One examiner stood inside the vault and another outside, surrounded by 4 or 5 assistants. They investigated the loans. John brought them out in armfuls, and the accountants checked them off and sent them back. When John brought out the 140 bonds left in the bundle of 200 Overland 4s, he placed on top of them the pile of 60 bonds taken from the other bundle of 600. Then he took them back, shifted over the 60, and brought out the bundle of 600 Overland 4s. Made up in part of the same bonds. It was the easiest thing going. The experts simply counted the 60 bonds twice, and John had the 60 bonds, or Prescott had them, down the street. Later, the same firm of experts certified to the presence of $300,000 of missing bonds, counting the same bundle, not only twice, but 5 and 6 times. You see, Prescott's John had grown wise in his generation. After that, he felt reasonably secure. It did seem almost unbelievable that such a situation could exist, but it was, nevertheless, a fact that it did. He expected momentarily that his theft would be detected, and that he would be thrown into prison, and his fear of the actual arrest, the moment of public ignominy, the shock and agony of his wife and family, were what drove him sleepless into the streets, and every evening to the theaters, to try to forget what must inevitably come. But the fact that he had gone wrong, that he was a thief, that he had betrayed his trust, had lost its edge. He now thought no more of shoving a package of bonds into his overcoat pocket than he did of taking that garment down from its peg behind the door. He knew from inquiry that men who stole a few $100s and were caught usually got as long a term as those who stole thousands. If he stole 1 bond, he was just as likely to get 10 years in state's prison as if he stole 50. So he stole 50. And when they were wiped out, he stole 50 more. And, well, if the reader is interested, he will learn before the end of the story just what John did steal. Somehow, Prescott's speculations never succeeded. Occasionally, they would make a good turn and get a few bonds back, but the next week there would be a new fiasco, and John would have to visit the Overland 4s again. That performance of the accountants had given him a huge contempt for bankers and banking. He knew that if he wanted to, he could grab up $1 million any day and walk off with it, but he didn't want to. All he desired now was to get back to where he was before. All the speculation was in the hands of Prescott, and Prescott never seemed worried in the least. He called on John almost daily for what extra bonds were needed as additional collateral, and John took his word absolutely as to the result of the transactions. He could not do otherwise, for one word from Prescott would have ruined him. Before long, the pile of 200 Overland 4s was gone. So was a large quantity of other securities, for John and Prescott had dropped cotton and had gone plunging into the stock market. Here, however, they had no better success than before. Of course, a difficulty arose when the interest on the Overland 4s came due. The coupons had to be cut by someone in the bank, and although John usually cut them, he did not always do so. Sometimes the loan clerk himself would take a hand and call for a particular lot of bonds. John, however, was now fertile in devices. The owner of the larger pile of 600 bonds usually wrote to have his coupons cut about the 27th of April. John would make up a collection of 600 bonds of the same sort, carry them up, and cut the coupons in the loan cage. The other man generally sent in a draft for his interest on the 2nd or 3rd of May. But now the bonds were away, scattered all over the street. So John started a new operation to get the bonds back and straighten out the coupon tangle. He substituted with the brokers an equal number of bonds of other companies, the interest upon which was not yet due. There was a large block of Electric 5s and Cumberland 4s, which served his purpose admirably, and thus he kept up with the game. When the coupons became due on the latter, he carried back the first. It kept him and Prescott busy most of the time juggling securities. At least John knew he was kept busy, and Prescott claimed to be equally so. There were many loans of brokers and others, all secured by the same sort of collateral. Most of these John appropriated. When it was necessary to check off the loans, John, having retained enough of the same kind of bonds to cover the largest loan, would bring up the same bundle time after time with a different name upon it. If one of the customers wanted to pay off a loan and his bonds were gone, he would be given someone else's collateral. Apparently, the only thing that was necessary was to have enough of each kind of security on hand to cover the largest loan on the books at any given time. Once, when the examiners were at work on the vault, John had to make up $100,000 in Overland 4s or 5s from the different small loans in the loan vault, and put them in a package in the deposit vault, in order to make it appear that certain depositors' bonds were all there. The most extraordinary performance of all was when, upon one of the annual examinations, John covered the absence of over 50 bonds in the collateral covering a certain loan by merely shoving the balance of the securities into the back of the vault, so that it was not examined at all. He had taken these bonds to substitute for others in different brokers' offices, and it so happened that there were no similar securities in the building. Thus the deficiency could not be covered up even by John's expert sleight of hand. Of course, if there had been other bonds of the same kind in another vault, it would have been a simple matter to substitute them, but there were not. So John pushed the remaining 150 bonds into a dark corner of the vault and awaited the discovery with throbbing pulses. Yet, strange to relate, these watchdogs of finance did not see the bonds which John had hidden, and did not discover that anything was wrong, since, for purposes of its own, the bank had neglected to make any record of the loan in question. It would really have been safer for John if he had taken the whole pile, but then he did not know that the accountants were going to do their business in any such crazy fashion. The whole thing came to seem a sort of joke to John. He never took any bonds for his own personal use. He gave everything to Prescott, and he rarely if ever saw Prescott except to hand him securities. One day Prescott walked right into the bank itself, and John gave him 165 bonds, which he stuffed under his overcoat and carried away. Remember that this is a fact. The thing, which began in August 1905, dragged over through the following year and on into 1907. John weathered 2 examinations by the accountants, the last being in October 1906, when they certified that the company was absolutely okay and everything intact. On that particular day, John had over $300,000 in Overland 4s and 5s scattered over the street. In the first 6 months, they lost $100,000 in cotton. Then they played both sides of the market in stocks and got badly bitten as bears in the temporary bull market in the autumn of 1906, selling Union Pacific at $165, which afterward went to $190, Northern Pacific at $185, which went to $200, etc., etc. Then they shifted their position, became bulls, and went long of stock just at the beginning of the present slump. They bought Reading at $118, American Smelters at $126, Pennsylvania at $130, Union at $145, and Northern Pacific at $180. At one time, John had $550,000 in bonds out of the vault. The thing might have been going on still had it not been for the fact that the anticipated merger between John's company and another was put through, and a new vault in a new building prepared to receive the securities. Of course, on such an occasion, a complete examination would be made of all the securities, and there would be practically no chance to deceive the accountants. Moreover, a part of the securities had actually been moved when the worst slump came, and they needed more. It was obvious that the jig was up. A few more days, and John knew that the gyves would be upon his wrists. Prescott and he took an account of the stock they had lost and went into committee on Ways and Means. Neither had any desire to run away. Wall Street was the breath of life to them. Prescott said that the best thing to do was to take enough more to stand off the company. He cited a case in Boston where a clerk who was badly in was advised by his lawyer to take $125,000 more. Then the lawyer dickered with the bank and brought it to terms. The lawyer got $25,000, the bank got the rest, and the thief was let go. Prescott said they ought to get away with enough more to make the bank's loss $1 million. He thought that would make them see what was the wise thing to do. Prescott also said he would try to get a lawyer who could bring some pressure to bear on the officials of the company. It would be a rather unpleasant situation to have brought to the attention of the state superintendent of banking. John agreed to get the additional securities and turn them over to Prescott. Unfortunately, almost everything had by this time been moved into the new vault, and all John could get was a stock certificate for 15,000 railroad shares standing in his own name and $75,000 in notes. These he gave to Prescott, thus increasing the amount stolen from the bank without discovery to between $600,000 and $700,000. This was on the day before the actuaries were to make their investigation. Knowing that his arrest was now only a question of time, John, about 11 o'clock on the following morning, left the trust company for the last time. He was in telephonic communication with Prescott, who in turn was in touch with their lawyer. Unfortunately, the president of the company had gone out of town over Sunday, so that again their plans went awry. For nearly 2 years, John had not known an hour devoid of haunting fear. From a cheerful and contented youth, he had become despondent, taciturn, and nervous. He was the same affectionate husband and attentive son as before, and his general characteristics remained precisely the same. He was scrupulous to a penny in every other department of his life, and undoubtedly would have felt the same pricks of conscience had he been guilty of any other act of dishonesty. The affair at the bank was a thing apart. The embezzler of $600,000 was not John at all, but a separate personality wearing John's clothes and bearing his name. He perceived clearly the enormity of his offense, but because he was the same John in every other respect, he had a feeling that somehow the fact that he had done the thing was purely fortuitous. In other words, that the bonds had to be taken, were going to be taken anyway, and that fate had simply elected him to take them. Surely he had not wanted the bonds, had had no intention of stealing $500,000, and in short was not the kind of a man who would steal $500,000. Each night he tossed sleepless till the light stole in through the shutters. At every corner on his way uptown he glanced over his shoulder behind him. The front doorbell never rang, that his muscles did not become rigid and his heart almost stopped beating. If he went to a theater or upon an excursion, he passed the time wondering if the next day he would still be a free man. In short, he paid in full in physical misery and mental anxiety and wretchedness for the real moral obliquity of his crime. The knowledge of this maddened him for what was coming. Yet he realized that he had stolen $500,000 and that justice demanded that he should be punished for it. After leaving the bank, John called up Prescott and learned that the plan to adjust matters with the president had miscarried by reason of the latter's absence. The two then met in a saloon, and here it was arranged that John should call up the loan clerk and tell him that something would be found to be wrong at the bank, but that nothing had better be said about it until the following Monday morning, when the president would return. The loan clerk, however, refused to talk with him and hung up the receiver. John had nowhere to go, for he dared not return home, and spent the afternoon until 6 o'clock riding in streetcars and sitting in saloons. At that hour he again communicated with Prescott, who said that he had secured rooms for him and his wife at a certain hotel, where they might stay until matters could be fixed up. John arranged to meet his wife at 42nd Street with Prescott and conduct her to the hotel. As fate decreed, the loan clerk came out of the subway at precisely the same time, saw them together, and followed them. Meantime, a hurry call had been sent for the president, who had returned to the city. John, fully aware that the end had come, went to bed at the hotel, and for the first time since the day he had taken the bonds 2 years before, slept soundly. At 3 the next morning there came a knock at the door. His wife awakened him, and John opened it. As he did so, a policeman forced his way in, and the loan clerk, who stood in the corridor just behind him, exclaimed theatrically, "Officer, there is your man." John is now in prison, serving out the sentence which the court believed it necessary to inflict upon him as a warning to others. Prescott is also serving a term at hard labor, a sentence somewhat longer than John's. The trust company took up their accounts, paid the losses of the luckless pair, and, owing to a rise in prices which came too late to benefit the latter, escaped with the comparatively trifling loss of little over $100,000. At once every banking house and trust company upon the street looked to its system of checks upon the honesty of its employees, and took precautions which should have been taken long before. The story was a 9 days' wonder. Then Union Pacific dropped 20 points more, the tide of finance closed over the heads of John and Prescott, and they were forgotten. Had the company, instead of putting itself at the mercy of a $35 a week clerk, placed double combinations on the loan and deposit vaults and employed 2 men, one to act as a check upon the other, to handle its securities, or had it merely adopted the even simpler expedient of requiring an officer of the company to be present when any securities were to be removed from the vaults, John would probably not now be in jail. It would seem that it would not be a difficult or complicated matter to employ a doorkeeper, who did not have access himself, to stand at the door of the vault and check off all securities removed therefrom or returned thereto. An officer of the bank should personally see that the loans earned up to the cage in the morning were properly returned to the vaults at night and secured with a time lock. Such a precaution would not cost the stockholders 0.1% in dividends. It is a trite saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But this is as true, in the case of financial institutions at least, from the point of view of the employee as of the company. It is an ingenious expedient to insure oneself with a Fidelity Corporation against the possible defalcations of one's servants, and doubtless certain risks can only be covered in some such fashion. These methods are eminently proper so far as they go, but they, unfortunately, do not serve the public purpose of protecting the weak from undue and unnecessary temptation. Banks and trust companies are prone to rely on the fact that most peculations are easily detected and severely punished, but the public interest demands that all business, state, municipal, and private, should be so conducted that dishonesty may not only be punished, but prevented. A builder who took a chance on the strength of a girder would have small credit in his profession. A good bridge is one which will bear the strain, not only of the pedestrian but of the elephant. A deluge, or an earthquake, may occur and the bridge may tumble, but next time it is built stronger and better. Thus science progresses and the public interest is subserved. A driver who overloads his beast is regarded as a fool or a brute. Perhaps such names are too harsh for those who overload the moral backbone of an inexperienced subordinate. Surely the fault is not all on one side. While there are no formulas to calculate the resiliency of the human character, we may demand the same prudence on the part of the officers of financial institutions as we do from nursemaids, lumbermen, and manufacturers of explosives. Though we may have confidence in the rectitude of our fellows, we have no right to ignore the limitations and weaknesses of mankind. It would not outrage the principles of justice if one who placed needless and disproportionate strain upon the morals of another were himself regarded as an accessory to the crime. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 7 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office. And God gives to every man the virtue, temper, understanding, taste, that lifts him into life and lets him fall just in the niche he was ordained to fill. The Task. Cooper. One morning there lay on my desk a note finely written in pencil and dated. Tombs Prison. Monsieur, would you be so gracious as to extend to the undersigned the courtesy of a private interview in your office? I have a communication of the highest importance to make to you. Respectfully, Charles Julius Francis de Nevers. Across the street in the courtyard, the prisoners were taking their daily exercise. 2 by 2 they marched slowly around the enclosure, in the center of which a small bed of geraniums struggled bravely in mortal combat with the dust and grime of Center Street. Some of the prisoners walked with heads erect and shoulders thrown back. Others slouched along with their arms dangling and their chins resting upon their chests. When one of them failed to keep up with the rest, a keeper, who stood in the shade by a bit of ivy in a corner of the wall, got after him. Somehow the note on the desk did not seem to fit any one of the gentry whom I could see so distinctly from my window. The name, too, did not have the customary tomb sound. De Nevers, de Nevers. I repeated it slowly to myself with varying accent. It seemed as though I had known the name before. It carried with it a suggestion of the novels of Stanley J. Weyman, of books on old towns and the chateaux and cathedrals of France. I wondered who the devil Charles Julius Francis de Nevers could be. Of course, if one answered all the letters one gets from the tombs, it would keep a secretary busy most of the working hours of the day. And if one acceded to all the various requests the prisoners make to interview them personally, or to see their fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, sweethearts, and wives, a prosecutor might as well run an intelligence office and be done with it. But as I reread the note, I began to have a sneaking feeling of curiosity, to see what Charles Julius Francis de Nevers looked like. So I departed from the usual rule of my office, rang for a messenger, and directed him to ascertain the full name of the prisoner from whom the note had come, the crime with which he was charged, and the date of his incarceration, also to supply me at once with copies of the indictment and the complaint. Then I instructed him to have de Nevers brought over as soon as he could be got into shape. I had almost forgotten that I was expecting a visitor when, a couple of hours later, an undersized deputy sheriff entered my office and reported that he had a prisoner in his custody for whom I had sent to the tombs. Glancing up from my desk, I saw standing behind his keeper a tall and distinguished-looking man in fashionably cut garments, whose well-shaped head and narrow face, thin aquiline nose, and carefully trimmed pointed beard seemed to bespeak somewhat different antecedents from those of the ordinary occupant of a cell in the city prison. I should have instinctively risen from my chair and offered my aristocratic-looking visitor a chair, had not the keeper unconsciously brought me to a realization of my true position by remarking, "Say, counselor, I guess while you're talking to his nibs I'll step out into the hall and take a smoke." "Certainly," said I, glad to be rid of him. "I will be responsible for the, prisoner." Then, as the keeper hesitated in putting his suggestion into execution, I reached into the upper right-hand drawer of my desk, produced 2 of what are commonly known in the parlance of the criminal courts buildings as cigars, and handed them to him. "Well," said I, after the keeper had departed, closing the door behind him, and leaving the visitor standing in the middle of the office, "I have sent for you, as you requested, and shall be glad to hear anything you have to say. Of course, any communication which you may see fit to make to me is voluntary, and, in the event for your trial for any crime with which you may be charged, may be used against you." I had a certain feeling of embarrassment in making this customary declaration, since the whole idea of this person being a criminal was so incongruous as to put a heavy strain on one's credulity. However, I recalled that a certain distinguished Englishman of letters has declared that there is no essential incongruity between crime and culture. He acknowledged my remark with a slight smile of half-amused deprecation, and with a courteous bow took the seat to which I motioned him. "I wish to thank you," he said in excellent English, marked by the slightest possible suggestion of a foreign accent, "for your exceeding courtesy in responding so quickly to my request. I am aware," he added, "that it is unusual for prisoners to seek interviews with the, what shall I say, juge d'instruction, as we call him, but," he added with a smile, "I think you will find that mine is an unusual affair." I had already begun to think so, and, reaching to the upper drawer on the left-hand side of my desk, I produced from the box reserved for judges, prominent members of the bar, borough presidents, commissioners of departments, and distinguished foreigners, a Havana of the variety known in our purlieus as a good cigar, and tendered the same to him. "Ah," he said, "many thanks, merci, non, I do not smoke the cigar. Monsieur perhaps has a cigarette?" Monsieur will pardon me if I say that this is the first act of kindness which has been accorded to me since my incarceration 3 weeks ago." Somewhere I found a box of cigarettes, one of which he removed, gracefully holding it between fingers which I noticed were singularly white and delicate, and lighting it with the air of a diplomat at an international conference. "You can hardly appreciate," he ventured, "the humiliation to which I, an officer and a gentleman of France, have been subjected." I lighted the cigar, which he had declined, and, with mingled feelings of embarrassment, distrust, and curiosity, inquired if his name was Charles Julius Francis de Nevers. I wish it were possible to describe the precise look which flashed across his face as he answered my question. "That is my name," he said, "or, at least, rather, I am Charles Julius Francis, and I am of Nevers. May I speak confidentially? Were my family to be aware of my present situation, they would never recover from the humiliation and disgrace connected with it." "Certainly," said I. "Anything which you may tell me, which you wish to be kept confidential, I will treat as such, provided, of course, that what you tell me is the truth." "You shall hear nothing else," he replied. Then, leaning back in his chair, he said simply, and with great dignity, "I am by direct inheritance today the Duc de Nevers, my father, the last Duke, having died in the month of February 1905. Any such announcement would ordinarily have filled me with amusement, but that the gentleman sitting before me should declare himself to be a duke or even a prince seemed entirely natural. "Indeed," said I, unable to think of any more appropriate remark. "Yes," said de Nevers, "and monsieur is naturally surprised that one of my distinguished position should be now a tenant of an American jail. But if monsieur will do me the honor of listening for a few moments, I will explain my present extraordinary predicament. I am Charles Julius Francois, eldest son of the late Oscar Oudin, Duc de Nevers, Grand Commander of the Legion of Honor and Knight of the Garter. I was born in Paris in the year 1860, at 148 Rue Champs-Élysées. My mother, the Dowager Duchess, is now residing at the Château de Nevers in the province of Nièvre in France. My sister Jeanne married Prince Henry of Arenberg and now lives in Brussels, at the Palais d'Arenberg, situated at the corner of the Rue de Regence near the Palais de Justice. My sister Louise, the Countess of Kilkenny, is living in Ireland. My sister Camille married the Marquis of Londonderry and is residing in London at the present time. My sister Evelyn married the Earl of Dudley and is living in Dublin. I have one other sister, Marie, who is with my mother. My brother, Count André de Nevers, is at present naval attaché in Berlin. My brother Fernand is an officer of artillery stationed in Madagascar, and my youngest brother Marcel is also an officer of artillery, attached to the 8th Regiment in Nancy. I make this statement, by way of introduction, in order that you may understand fully my situation. During my childhood I had an English tutor in Paris, and when I reached the age of 10 years I was sent by my father to the Collège Louis le Grand, where I took the course of Science and Letters, and graduated from the Lycée with the degree of Bachelor on the 5th of August, 1877. Having passed my examination for the Polytechnic, I remained there 2 years, and on my graduation received a commission as sous-lieutenant of engineers, and immediately entered the application school at Fontainebleau, where I was graduated in 1881 as lieutenant of engineers and assigned to the 1st Regiment of Engineers at Versailles. De Nevers paused and exhaled the cigarette smoke. "Monsieur will pardon me if I go into detail, for only in that way will he be convinced of the accuracy of what I am telling him." "Pray go on," said I. "If what you tell me is true, your case is extraordinary indeed." "My first act of service," continued de Nevers, "was on the 10th of August, when I was sent to Tonkin. I will not trouble you with the details of my voyage on the transport to China, but will simply state that I was wounded in the engagement at Yungchuang on the 7th of November of the same year, and had the distinction of receiving the Cross of the Legion of Honor therefor. I was immediately furloughed back to France, where I entered the Superior School of War and took my Staff Major brevet. At the same time I seized the opportunity to follow the course of the Sorbonne, and secured the additional degree of Doctor of Science. I had received an excellent education in my youth, and always had a taste for study, which I have taken pains to pursue in whatever part of the world I happen to be stationed. As a result, I am able to converse with considerable fluency in English, as perhaps you have already observed, as well as in Spanish, Italian, German, Russian, Arabic, and, to a considerable extent, in Japanese. In 1883, I was sent to Berlin as military attaché, but was subsequently recalled because I had violated the rules of international etiquette by fighting 3 duels with German officers. The ambassador at this time was Charles de Courcelles. You will understand that there was no disgrace connected with my recall, but the necessity of defending my honor was incompatible with the rules of the service, and after 15 months in Berlin, I was remanded to Versailles with the rank of first lieutenant under Colonel Quinivet. Here I pursued my studies and was then ordered to the Sudan, whence, after being wounded, I was sent to Senegal. Here I acted as governor of the city of St. Louis. As you are doubtless aware, the climate of Senegal is exceedingly unhealthy. I fell ill with a fever and was obliged to return to France, where I was assigned to the office of the General Staff Major in Paris. At the opening of the war with Dahomey in 1892, I was sent in command of the engineers of the Corps Expeditionnaire, and on the 17th of November of that year was severely wounded at Dakar in Dahomey, having received a spear cut through the lungs. On this occasion, I had the distinction of being promoted as Major of Engineers, and was created an officer of the Legion of Honor on the battlefield. The wound in my lungs was of such a serious character that Colonel Dodds sent me back once more to France on furlough, and President Carnot was kind enough to give me his personal commendation for my services. I was now 33 years old, and had already attained high rank in my profession. I had had opportunity to pursue studies in chemistry, medicine, and science, and my only interest was in the service of my country, and in qualifying myself for my future duties. My life, up to that time, had been uniformly happy. I was the eldest son, and beloved both of my father and mother. My social position gave me the entrée to the best of society wherever I happened to be. As yet, however, I had never been in love. At this time occurred the affair which in a measure changed my career. The wound in my lungs was slow in healing, and at the earnest invitation of my sister, Lady Londonderry, I went to London. At that time she was living in Belgravia Square. It was here I met my first wife. De Nevers paused. The cigarette had gone out. For the first time he seemed to lose perfect control of himself. I busied myself with some papers, until he should have regained his self-possession. "You will understand," he said in a few moments. "These things are not governed by law and statute. The woman with whom I fell in love, and who was in every respect the equal in intellectual attainments, beauty, and charm of manner of my own people, was the nursery governess in my sister's household. She returned my affection and agreed to marry me. The proposed marriage excited the utmost antipathy on the part of my family. My fiancé was dismissed from my sister's household, and I returned to Paris with the intention of endeavoring by every means in my power to induce my father to permit me to wed the woman I loved. It is doubtless difficult for monsieur to appreciate the position of a French officer. In America, America is free, one can marry the woman one loves. But in France, no officer can marry without the consent of the Minister of War and of the President of the Republic. And more than that, he cannot marry unless his intended wife possesses a dowry of at least 50,000 francs, which must be deposited with the Minister of War for investment. In spite of the fact that I enjoyed the confidence and friendship of President Carnot, the latter, at my father's request, refused me permission to marry. There was no choice left for me but to resign my commission, and this I did. I returned to England and was married at St. Thomas's Church, London, on the 21st of June, 1893. My education as an engineer had been of the most highly technical and thorough character, and I had every reason to believe that in America I could earn a comfortable living. My wife and I therefore sailed for America immediately after our marriage. I first secured a position in some ironworks in South Boston, and for a time lived happily. A boy, Oscar, named after my father, was born to us while we were living in the town of Winchester, near Boston. Another son was born a year later in the same place, and still a third in Pittsburgh, where I had gone to assume the position of general foreman of the Homestead Steel Works, and assistant master mechanic of the Carnegie Steel Company. I rapidly secured the confidence of my employers, and was sent upon several occasions to study new processes in different parts of the country. During one of my vacations we returned to England, and visited my wife's people, who lived in Manchester. Here she died on the 17th of June, 1901. De Nevers paused again, and it was some moments before he continued. After the death of my wife, my father expressed himself as ready for a reconciliation, but although this took place, I had not the heart to remain in France. I liked America, and had attained distinction in my profession. I therefore expressed my intention of returning to continue my career as an engineer, but at the earnest solicitation of my father, left my 3 children with my parents. They are now living at the chateau of my mother at Nievre. I was sent to Chicago to study a new blast furnace, and 2 years later, when Mr. Schwab organized the Russo-American Company at Mariupol, South Siberia, he offered me the position of general manager, which I accepted. Here I remained until November 1904, when all of the American engineers were arrested and imprisoned on the order of General Kozubsky of the Russian engineers, who at the same time shot and murdered my assistant, Thomas D. McDonald, for refusing to allow him to remove pig iron from the storehouse without giving a receipt for it. Ambassador McCormick secured our immediate release, and we returned to the States. Monsieur has no idea of the power of these Russian officers. The murder of my assistant was of the most brutal character. Kozubsky came to my office and demanded the iron, but having secured it, refused to sign the receipt which McDonald presented to him. McDonald said, "You shall not remove the iron if you do not sign the receipt." As he spoke the words, the general drew his revolver and shot him down like a dog. I returned to America in January 1905, and have since then been doing work as a consulting engineer. Last January I visited my parents in Paris at their home at 148 Champs-Élysées. You have doubtless seen the mansion with its 2 gates and black railing of decorative iron. I had no sooner returned to America than I received a cable announcing the death of my father. De Nevers removed from his breast pocket a bundle of carefully folded papers, from which he produced a sheet of heavy stationery with a deep border of mourning and a large black cross at the top, of which the following is a copy. Her Grace the Duchess Dowager of Nevers, His Grace the Duke Charles J.F. of Nevers and his children, Oscar, Hilda, and John, Their Highnesses the Prince and Princess Henry of Arenberg, Captain the Count André of Nevers, Captain the Count Fernand of Nevers, the Earl and Countess of Kilkenny, the Marquis and Marchioness of Londonderry, the Earl and Countess of Dudley, the Countess Marie of Nevers, Lieutenant the Count Marcel of Nevers, have the sorrow to announce the subite death at the family seat at Nevers, France, of His Grace Oscar Odon, Duke of Nevers, Grand Commander of the Legion of Honor, Knight of the Garter. Their husband, father, grandfather, and uncle beloved. Masonic burial shall take place at Nevers on Tuesday, February 21st, 1905. New York, February 20th, 1905, USA. The announcement was carefully engraved and was of an expensive character, and I read it with considerable interest. Does Monsieur care to see the photographs of my family? Here, producing a photograph of a gentleman and a lady and a group of children, is my wife with the 3 children, taken in London just before she died. Another group, bearing the trademark of a Parisian photographer, exhibited a distinguished-looking man surrounded by a group of many children of varying ages. These, said de Nevers, are my father and my brothers and sisters. Then came photographs of Lady Londonderry and the Earl and Countess of Dudley. My interest in my visitor's story had for the moment completely driven from my mind the real object of the interview, which ostensibly was to explain the reason for his incarceration. His straightforward narrative carried absolute conviction with it. That he was the legitimate Duc de Nevers I accepted without hesitation. That he was a man of education, culture, and many accomplishments was self-evident. "You have had an extraordinary career," I ventured. "Yes," he replied. "It has been a life of action, and I may say, of suffering. Permit me to show you the certificate of my general that what I have told you is accurate." And de Nevers unfolded from his pocket a document bearing a seal of the French Ministry of War, which read as follows: République Française, Ministère de la Guerre, Cabinet du Ministère, number 195, Paris, October 24th, 1901. To whom it may concern. I, George André, General of Division of Engineers, Minister of War of the French Republic, certify that the Lieutenant Colonel Charles Jules Comte François de Nevers is connected with the French Army since the 10th day of September 1877, and that the following is a true copy of his record. Born in Paris, the 10th of June, 1859. Graduated, Bachelor of Sciences and Letters, from the Lycée Louis le Grand, the 5th of August, 1877. Received first as Chief of Promotion of the National Polytechnic School of France, the 10th of September, 1877. Graduated with the greatest distinction from the above school, the 1st of September, 1879. Entered the Application School of Military Engineers at Fontainebleau as Second Lieutenant, Chief of Promotion, the 15th of September, 1879. Graduated as Lieutenant of Engineers with great distinction, the 1st of August, 1881, and sent to the 1st Regiment of Engineers at Versailles. Sent to Tonkin the 1st day of August, 1881. Wounded at Yungchuang, Tonkin, the 7th of November, 1881. Inscribed on the Golden Book of the French Army, the 10th of November, 1881. Made Knight of the Legion of Honor, the 10th of November, 1881. Wounded at Suisang, the 4th of January, 1882. Sent to Switzerland in mission, where he was graduated at the Zurich Polytechnic University as mechanical engineer, 1884. Sent the 2nd of January, 1885 to Sudan. Wounded there twice. Made Captain of Engineers the 3rd of June, 1885. Called back to France the 6th of September, 1885. Sent in mission in Belgium, where he was graduated as electrical engineer from the Montefiore University at Liège. Made Officer of Academy. Sent in Gabon the 2nd of May, 1887. Wounded twice. Constructed there the military railroad. Sent to Senegal as commander the 6th of July, 1888, to organize administration. Wounded once. Called back and sent to Germany the 7th of December, 1889. Called back from Germany and assigned to the Creusot as assistant chief engineer. Sent to Dahomey the 1st of January, 1891. Wounded the 19th of November, 1892 at Dahomey. Made Major of Engineers on the battlefield. Made Officer of the Legion of Honor on the battlefield. By special decision of the Senate and the Chamber of Representatives, the name of Commandant Charles Jules Comte Francois de Nevers is embroidered the 21st of November on the flag of the Regiment of Engineers. Called back and sent to Algeria the 3rd of January, 1893. Made Ordinance of the President Carnot the 5th of February, 1893. Sent to the Creusot the 1st of July, 1893 as Director. Sent to Madagascar the 2nd of April, 1894 in command of the Engineers. Wounded the 12th of July, 1894 at Majungwa. Made Lieutenant Colonel of Engineers the 12th of July, 1894 on the battlefield. Proposed as Commander of the Legion of Honor on the same date. Called back and sent as Ordnance Officer of the General-in-Chief in Command in Algeria the 4th of March, 1896. Sent to America in special mission to the Klondike the 7th of July, 1897. Put on disponibility hors cadre on his demand the 1st of November, 1897. Made Honorary Member of the National Defenses, commissioned the 28th of January, 1898. Made Honorary Member of the Commission on Railroads, Canals, and Harbors the 7th of July, 1899. Made Honorary Member of the Commission on Bridges and Highways the 14th of July, 1900. Made Corresponding Member of the Academy of Sciences the 14th of July, 1901. Made Commander of the Legion of Honor the 22nd of October, 1901. I will say further that the Lieutenant Colonel Charles Jules Comte Francois de Nevers is regarded as one of our best and most loyal officers, that he has the goodwill and best wishes of the government and of all his fellow officers, and is considered by everybody as a great worker and a thoroughly honest man. I personally will be pleased to do anything in my power to help him in any business he may undertake, and can recommend him to everybody as a responsible and trustworthy engineer, knowing him for the last 24 years. Gio André, Minister of War. Seal. The document seemed in substance merely a repetition of what de Nevers had already told me, and I handed it back to him, satisfied of its correctness. But public business is public business, and if the Duc de Nevers had anything to communicate to me in my official character, it was time for him to do so. "Well, Duke," said I, not knowing very well how otherwise to address him, "do you desire to communicate anything to me in connection with your present attention in the tombs?" "Ah," he said, with a gesture of deprecation, "I can hardly understand that myself. Perhaps Monsieur has the papers. Ah, yes, I see they are on his desk. Monsieur will observe that I am accused of the crime of... what is it called in English? "Ah, yes, perjury, but I assure monsieur that is entirely mistake." I picked up the indictment, and found that the grand jury of the county of New York accused one Charles de Nevers of the crime of perjury committed as follows: that one William Douglas, having been arrested by William W. Crawford, a member of the police force of the city of New York, upon the charge of having violated the motor vehicle law of the state of New York, ordinance against speeding, he, the said Charles de Nevers, had then and there offered himself to go bail for the said Douglas, and did sign a certain written undertaking called a bond, for the appearance of the said Douglas before the magistrate, wherein he swore that he owned a certain house and lot situate at 122 West 117th Street, in the county of New York, which was free and clear of all encumbrances, and of the value of not less than $20,000. Whereas in truth and in fact, he, the said Charles de Nevers, did not own the said house and lot, which did not then and there stand in the name of him, the said Charles de Nevers, but was the property of one Helen M. Bent, and so recorded in the registry of deeds. Which, said the grand jury, Charles de Nevers then and there well knew. And so they accused him of feloniously, knowingly, wilfully, corruptly, and falsely committing the crime of perjury, against the form of the statute in such cases made and provided, and against the peace of the people of the state of New York and their dignity. And this they did over the signature of William Travers Jerome, District Attorney. "How did this happen?" I inquired, hardly believing my senses. "Was it a fact that you made this false statement to the police for the purpose of securing bail for Mr. Douglas?" De Nevers leaned forward and was about to answer, when a messenger entered the room and stated that I was wanted in the court. "Another time, if monsieur will permit me," said he. "I have much to thank you for. If monsieur will give me another hearing, it shall be my pleasure to explain fully." I rose and summoned the keeper. De Nevers bowed and offered his hand, which I took. "I have much to thank you for," he repeated. As I hurried out of the room, I encountered the keeper outside the door. "Say, counselor, what sort of a con was he throwing into you?" he inquired with a wink. De Nevers was well inside my office, looking drearily out of my window towards the courtyard and the tombs, where his fellows were still pursuing their weary march. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Why, who did his nibs tell you he was?" "The Duc de Nevers," I replied. "Say," said O'Toole, "you don't mean you swallowed that, do you? Do you know what that feller did? Why, one afternoon when a swell guy and his girl were out in their gas wagon, a mounted cop in the park pulls them in and takes them over to the 57th Street court. Well, just as me friend is taking them into the house, along walks this Charlie Nevers, with his tall silk hat and pearl-handle cane, with a flower in his buttonhole, and his black coat-tails dangling around his heels, just like Bonnie de Castellane. And says he, 'Officer,' says he, 'may I inquire what for you're apprehending this gentleman and lady?' says he. With that, me friend hands him out some strong language for butting in, and Charlie is so much shocked at the insult to himself and the lady that he steps in before the sergeant and offers to go bond for Douglas, just to go the cop one better, giving the sergeant the same line of drip that he's been handing out to us in the tombs, about his being the son of Oscar the Duc de Nevers and related to all the crowned heads in Europe. Then he ups and signs the bail bond for a house and lot that he has never seen in his life, and here he is up agin it, and it's a good stiff one his honor'll be handing out to him, to my way of thinking, for these highfalutin foreigners has got to be put a stop to, and Charlie Nevers is a good one to begin on." "I think you're wrong, O'Toole," said I, "but we can tell better later on." All that day my thoughts kept reverting to the Duc de Nevers. One thing was more than certain, and that was that of all the various personages whom I had met during my journey through the world, none was more fitted to be a duke than he. I was obliged to confess that during my hour's interview I had felt myself to be in the company of a superior being, one of different clay from that of which I was composed, a man of better brain and better education, vastly more rounded and experienced, a cultivated citizen of the world, who would be at home in any company no matter how distinguished, and who would rise to any emergency. As I ate my dinner at the club, the name de Nevers played mistily in the recesses of my memory. De Nevers, surely there was something historic about it, some flavor of the days of kings and courtiers. Smoking my cigar in the library, I fell into a reverie in which the tombs, with its towers and grated windows, figured as a grey chateau of old Touraine, and Charles Julius Francis, in hunting costume, as a medieval Monseigneur with a hooded falcon on his wrist. I awoke to find directly in my line of vision upon the shelf of the alcove in front of me the solid phalanx of the 10 volumes of Larousse's Grand Dictionnaire Univers du 19th siècle, and I reached forward and pulled down the letter N. Nevers. There it was. Capital of the Department of Nièvre. Ducal palace built in 1475. Charles III de Gazagnes, petit-fils de Charles II, had sold the Duchy of Nevers and his other domains in France to Cardinal Mazarin par acte du July 11, 1659. So far so good. The cardinal had left the duchy by will to Philippe Jules François Mancini, his nephew, who had died May 8, 1707. Ah, Julius Francis. It was like meeting an old friend. Philippe Jules François Mancini. Mazarin had obtained letters confirming him in the possession of the Duchy of Nivernais and Danzois in 1720. Then he had died in 1768, leaving the duchy to Louis-Jules Bourbon Mancini Mazzarini. This son, who was the last Duke of Nivernais, had died in 1798. He was the last of the name, said Larousse. I rubbed my eyes. It was there fast enough, last of the name. Something was wrong. Without getting up, I rang for a copy of Burke's Peerage. Londonderry, Marquess of, married October 2, 1875, Lady Teresa Susie Helen, Lady of Grace of St. John of Jerusalem, eldest daughter of the 19th Earl of Shrewsbury. Dear me. Dudley, Earl of, married September 14, 1891, Rachel, Lady of Grace of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, youngest daughter of Charles Henry Gurney. I closed the book and began to think, and the more I thought, the more I wondered. There really didn't seem particular need of going further. If the fellow was a fraud, he was a fraud, that was all. But how in heaven's name could a man make up a story like that? That night I dreamed once more of the ducal palace of Nivernais, only its courtyard resembled that of the tombs, and many couples walked in a straggling line beneath its walls. A day or two passed, and I had heard no more of the Duke Charles Julius, when one afternoon a lady called at my office and sent in her name as Mrs. de Nevers. She proved to be an attractive young woman, a little over 20, dressed in black, whose face showed that she had suffered more than a little. She explained that her husband was confined in the tombs on a charge of perjury. But that was not all. He was worse than a perjurer. He was an impostor, a bigamist. He had another wife living somewhere in England. In Manchester, she thought. Oh, it was too terrible. He had told her that he was the Count Charles de Nevers, eldest son of the Duc de Nevers, in France, you know, and she had believed him. He had had letters to everybody in Montreal, her home, and plenty of money and beautiful clothes. He had dazzled her completely. The wedding had been quite an affair, and presents had come from the Duke and Duchess of Nevers, from the Marquess of Londonderry, and from the Countess of Dudley. There were also letters from the Prince and Princess of Arenberg in Belgium, and the Counts André and Fernand of Nevers. It had all been so wonderful and romantic. Then they had gone on their wedding journey and had been ecstatically happy. In Chicago they had been received with open arms. That was before the death of the Duke. Yes, her mourning was for the Duke. She smiled sadly. I think she still more than half believed that she was a duchess, and she deserved to be if ever any girl did. Then all of a sudden their money had given out, and the Duke had been arrested for not paying their hotel bill. Perhaps I would like to see a newspaper clipping. It was dreadful. She was ashamed to be seen anywhere after that. She had even been obliged to pawn his Cross of the Legion of Honor, the Leopold Cross of Belgium, and another beautiful decoration which he had been accustomed to wear when they went out to dinner. This was the clipping. Chicago society, the dupe of bogus Count. Hotel and several whilom friends filled with regret. The Count arrested. Chicago, January 29th. Count Charles Julius François de Nevers was in the police court today for defrauding the auditorium annex of a board bill. The Count came to the French consul, Monsieur Henri Maran, amply supplied with credentials. He posed as consulting engineer of the United States Steel Corporation. He was introduced into all the clubs, including the Alliance Française, where he was entertained and spoke on literature. He was accompanied by a charming young countess, and the honors showered upon them and the adulation paid by society tuft-hunters was something they will never forget. They returned the entertainments. The Count borrowed several $1,000s. President Ferber of the Olympic Games said today of the Count This man confided to me that he had invented a machine for perpetual motion, the chief difficulty of which was that it accumulated energy so fast that it could not be controlled. He asked me to invest in some of his schemes, which I refused to do. The fate of the Count is still pending, and he was led back to a cell. He has been a week behind the bars. The Countess is in tears. The Countess is me, she explained. Was he sent to prison, I asked. Oh no, she answered. You see, they really couldn't tell whether he was a Count or not, so they had to let him go. He ought to be hung, I cried. I really think he ought, she answered. You see, it is quite embarrassing, because legally I have never been married at all, have I? I don't know, I answered, lying like a gentleman. Time enough to look that up later. I found out afterwards, she said, apparently somewhat encouraged, that his first wife was a nursemaid in London. Yes, said I, he told me so himself. Just then there came a knock at my door, and O'Toole appeared. How are you, Counselor? He said with a grin. You know Charlie Nevere? Well, of all the pious frauds. Say, Counselor, ain't he the cute feller? What do you suppose now? I got his record today. Cast your eye over it. I did. This is it. Number 98, number B7721, the Central Office, Bureau of Detectives, Police Department of the City of New York, 300 Mulberry Street. Name, Charles Francois. Alias, Count de Nevers. Date of arrest, 1903. Place of arrest, London, England. Cause of arrest, false pretenses. Name of court, Sessions. To what prison? Penal servitude. Term of imprisonment, 18 months. Remarks, fraudulently obtained motor car in London, under pretense that he was Charles Duc de Nevers, son of Oscar, Prince de Nevers. So he's an ex-convict, I exclaimed. He's more than that, cried O'Toole. He's a bird. I turned to Mrs. de Nevers, or whoever she legally was. How did he come to do such a foolish thing as to offer to go on the bail bond of a perfect stranger? What good could it do him? He was sure to be caught. I don't know, said she. He was always doing things like that. He wanted to seem fine and grand, I guess. We always traveled in style. Why, the afternoon he signed the bond, he came home and told me how the police had been troubling a gentleman who had a lady with him in an automobile, and how he was able to settle the whole affair without the slightest difficulty and send them on their way. He was quite pleased about it. But why do you suppose he did it? He just thought he'd do 'em a favor, suggested O'Toole, and in that way get in with 'em, and take their money later, mebbe. Who is he? Do you know? I asked the girl. I haven't the vaguest idea, she sighed. A week later, Charles Julius Francis stood at the bar of justice, convicted of perjury. His degradation had wrought no change in the dignity of his bearing, or the impassiveness of his general appearance, and he received the sentence of the court without a tremor, and with shoulders thrown back and head erect, as befitted a scion of a noble house. There's just one thing for me to do with you, Charles Francis, said the judge rudely, and that is to send you to state prison for a term of 5 years at hard labor. Francis made no sign. There is one other thing I should like to know, however, continued his honor, and that is who you really are. The prisoner bowed slightly. I am Charles Julius Francis, he replied quietly, Duc de Nevers and Commander of the Legion of Honor. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 8 of True Stories of Crime from the District Attorney's Office, by our insignificant amount of crime existing in comparison with the extraordinary scope of criminal opportunity. To be sure, the number of crimes actually detected is infinitesimal as contrasted with those committed. But even so, the conviction constantly grows that the world is astonishingly honest when one considers the unlikelihood that any specific prospective offense will be discovered. How few dishonest servants there are, for example, out of the million or so composing that class of persons, who have an unlimited opportunity to snap up not only unconsidered trifles, but personal property of great value. The actual honesty of the servants is probably greater than that of the masters in the final analysis. Men are not only presumed to be innocent in the eyes of the law, but are found to be so as a matter of daily experience, so far as honesty in the ordinary affairs of life is concerned, and the fact that we rely so implicitly upon the truthfulness and integrity of our fellows is the principal reason why violations of this imperative social law should be severely dealt with. If it were possible adequately to determine or deal with any such issue, mere lying should be made a crime. It is a matter of constant wonder that shrewd businessmen will put through all sorts of deals when thousands of dollars are at stake, relying entirely upon the word of some single person whom they do not in fact know. John Smith is looking for a house. He finds one he likes with an old lady, who says her name is Sarah Jones, living in it, and offers her $40,000 for her real estate. She accepts. His lawyer searches the title and finds that Sarah Jones is the owner of record. The old lady is invited to the lawyer's office, executes a warranty deed, and goes off with the $40,000. Now, in a great number of instances, no one really knows whether the aged dame is Sarah Jones or not, and she perhaps may be, and sometimes is, only the caretaker's second cousin, who is looking after the house in the latter's absence. There are thousands of acres of land and hundreds of millions of money waiting at compound interest to be claimed by unknown heirs or next of kin. Even if the real ones cannot be found, one would think that this defect could be easily supplied by some properly ingenious person. My Uncle Bill went to sea in '45 and was never heard from again. Will you find out if he left any money? Wrote a client to the author. Careful search failed to reveal any money. But if the money had been found first, how easy it would have been to turn up a nephew. Yet the industry of producing properly authenticated nephews, heirs, legatees, next of kin, and claimants of all sorts has never been adequately developed. There are plenty of agents who, for a moderate fee, will inform you whether or not there is a fortune waiting for you, but there is no agency within the writer's knowledge which will supply an heir for every fortune. From a business point of view, the idea seems to have possibilities. Some few years after the Civil War, a Swede named Ebbe Peterson emigrated to this country to better his condition. Fortune smiled upon him, and he amassed a modest bank account, which, with considerable foresight, he invested in a large tract of unimproved land in the region known as the Bronx, New York City. In the summer of 1888, Peterson determined to take a vacation and revisit Sweden, and accordingly deeded all his real estate to his wife. Just before starting, he decided to take his wife and only child, a little girl of 10 or 12, with him. Accordingly, they set sail from Hoboken Saturday, August 11th, upon the steamer Geyser of the Thingvalla line bound for Copenhagen. At 4 o'clock Tuesday morning, at a point 30 miles south of Sable Island and 200 miles out of Halifax, the Geyser, in the midst of a thick fog, crashed suddenly into a sister ship, the Thingvalla of the same line, and sank. The Thingvalla was herself badly crippled, but, after picking up 31 survivors, managed to limp into Halifax, from which port the rescued were brought to New York. Only 14 of the Geyser's passengers had been saved, and the Petersons were not among them. They were never heard of again, and no relatives came forward to claim their property, which, happening to be in the direct line of the city's development, was in course of time mapped out into streets and house lots, and became exceedingly valuable. Gradually houses were built upon it, various people bought it for investment, and it took on the look of other semi-developed suburban property. In the month of December 1905, over 17 years after the sinking of the Geyser, a lawyer named H. Huffman Brown offered to sell, at a bargain, to a young architect named Benjamin Levitan, 2 house lots adjacent to the southwest corner of 174th Street and Monroe Avenue, New York City. It so happened that Brown had, not long before, induced Levitan to go into another real estate deal, in which the architect's suspicions had been aroused by finding that the property alleged by the lawyer to be improved was in fact unbuilt upon. He had lost no money in the original transaction, but he determined that no such mistake would occur a second time, and he accordingly visited the property, and also had a search made of the title, which revealed the fact that Brown was not the record owner, as he had stated, but that on the contrary the land stood in the name of William R. Hubert. It should be borne in mind that both the parties to this proposed transaction were men well known in their own professions. Brown, particularly, was a real estate lawyer of some distinction, and an editor of what were known as the old New York Civil Procedure Reports. He was a middle-aged man, careful in his dress, particular in his speech, modest and quiet in his demeanor, by reputation a gentleman and a scholar, and had practiced at the New York bar some 25 years. But Levitan, who had seen many wolves in sheep's clothing, and had something of the Sherlock Holmes in his composition, determined to seek the advice of the district attorney. and having done so, received instructions to go ahead and consummate the purchase of the property. He, therefore, informed Brown that he had learned that the latter was not the owner of record, to which Brown replied that was true, but that the property really did belong to him in fact, being recorded in Hubert's name merely as a matter of convenience because Hubert was unmarried, and that moreover he, Brown, had an unrecorded deed from Hubert to himself which he would produce, or would introduce Hubert to Levitan and let him execute a deed direct. Levitan assented to the latter proposition, and the 14th of December, 1905, was fixed as the date for the delivery of the deeds and the payment for the property. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, Brown appeared at Levitan's office, where a detective was already in attendance, and stated that he had been unable to procure Mr. Hubert's personal presence, but had received from him deeds duly executed to the property. These he offered to Levitan. At this moment the detective stepped forward, took possession of the papers, and invited the lawyer to accompany him to the district attorney's office. To this Brown offered no opposition, and the party adjourned to the criminal courts building, where Mr. John W. Hart, an assistant district attorney, accused him of having obtained money from Levitan by means of false pretenses as to the ownership of the property, and requested from him an explanation. Brown replied without hesitation that he could not understand why this charge should be made against him, that he had in fact received the deeds from Mr. Hubert only a short time before he had delivered them to Levitan, that Mr. Hubert was in New York, that he was the owner of the property, and that no fraud of any sort had been attempted or intended. Mr. Hart now examined the supposed deeds and found that the signatures to them, as well as the signatures to a certain affidavit of title, which set forth that William R. Hubert was a person of substance, had all been executed before a notary, Ella F. Brayman, on that very day. He therefore sent at once for Mrs. Brayman, who, upon her arrival, immediately and without hesitation positively identified the defendant, H. Huffman Brown, as the person who had executed the papers before her an hour or so before. The case on its face seemed clear enough. Brown had apparently deliberately forged William R. Hubert's name, and it did not even seem necessary that Mr. Hubert should be summoned as a witness, since the property was recorded in his name, and Brown himself had stated that Hubert was then actually in New York. But Brown indignantly protested his innocence. It was clear, he insisted, that Mrs. Brayman was mistaken, for why in the name of common sense should he, a lawyer of standing, desire to forge Hubert's name, particularly when he himself held an unrecorded deed of the same property, and could have executed a good conveyance to Levitan had the latter so desired. Such a performance would have been utterly without an object. But the lawyer was nervous, and his description of Hubert as a wealthy mine owner from the West, who owned a great deal of property in New York and had an office in the Flatiron Building, did not ring convincingly in Mr. Hart's ears. The assistant district attorney called up the janitor of the building in question on the telephone. But no such person had an office there. Brown, much flustered, said the janitor was either a fool or a liar. He had been at Hubert's office that very morning. He offered to go and find him in 20 minutes. But Mr. Hart thought that the lawyer had better make his explanation before a magistrate, and caused his arrest and commitment on a charge of forgery. Little did he suspect what an ingenious fraud was about to be unearthed. The days went by, and Brown stayed in the Tombs, unable to raise the heavy bail demanded, but no Hubert appeared. Meantime the writer, to whom the case had been sent for trial, ordered a complete search of the title to the property, and in a week or so became possessed, to his amazement, of a most extraordinary and complicated collection of facts. He discovered that the lot of land offered by Brown to Levitan, and standing in Hubert's name, was originally part of the property owned by Ebbe Peterson, the unfortunate Swede who, with his family, had perished in the geyser off Cape Sable in 1888. The title search showed that practically all of the Peterson property had been conveyed by Mary A. Peterson to a person named Ignatius F. X. O'Rourke by a deed, which purported to have been executed on June 27, 1888, about 2 weeks before the Petersons sailed for Copenhagen, and which was signed with Mrs. Peterson's mark, but that this deed had not been recorded until July 3, 1899, 11 years after the loss of the geyser. The writer busied himself with finding someone who had known Mrs. Peterson, and by an odd coincidence discovered a woman living in the Bronx who had been an intimate friend and playmate of the little Peterson girl. This witness, who was but a child when the incident had occurred, clearly recalled the fact that Ebby Peterson had not decided to take his wife and daughter with him on the voyage until a few days before they sailed. They had then invited her, the witness, now a Mrs. Cantwell, to go with them, but her mother had declined to allow her to do so. Mrs. Peterson, moreover, according to Mrs. Cantwell, was a woman of education, who wrote a particularly fine hand. Other papers were discovered executed at about the same time, signed by Mrs. Peterson with her full name. It seemed inconceivable that she should have signed any deed, much less one of so much importance, with her mark, and moreover that she should have executed any such deed at all when her husband was on the spot to convey his own property. But the strangest fact of all was that the attesting witness to this extraordinary instrument was H. Huffman Brown. It also appeared to have been recorded at his instance 11 years after its execution. In the meantime, however, that is to say, between the sinking of the Geyser in '88 and the recording of Mary Peterson's supposed deed in '99, another equally mysterious deed to the same property had been filed. This document, executed and recorded in 1896, purported to convey part of the Peterson property to a man named John J. Kiley, and was signed by a person calling himself Charles A. Clark. By a later deed, executed and signed a few days later, John J. Kiley appeared to have conveyed the same property to Ignatius F. X. O'Rourke, the very person to whom Mrs. Peterson had apparently executed her deed in 1888. And H. Huffman Brown was the attesting witness to both these deeds. A glance at the following diagram will serve to clear up any confusion which may exist in the mind of the reader. 1888. Mary A. Peterson. By her mark, deed conveys to I. F. X. O'Rourke. Not recorded until 1899. 1896. Charles A. Clark conveys same property to John J. Kiley. 1896. John J. Kiley conveys to I. F. X. O'Rourke. O'Rourke thus holds land through two sources. Brown was the witness to both these parallel transactions. Of course, it was simple enough to see what had occurred. In 1896, a mysterious man named Clark, without vestige of right or title, so far as the records showed, had conveyed Ebby Peterson's property to a man named Kiley, equally unsubstantial, who had passed it over to one O'Rourke. Then Brown had suddenly recorded Mrs. Peterson's deed, giving O'Rourke the very same property. Thus, this O'Rourke, whoever he may have been, held all the Peterson property by two chains of title, one through Clark and Kiley, and the other through Mrs. Peterson. Then he had gone ahead and deeded it all away to various persons, through one of whom William R. Hubert had secured his title. But every deed on record which purported to pass any fraction of the Peterson property was witnessed by H. Huffman Brown, and Brown was the attesting witness to the deed under which Hubert purported to hold. Thus the chain of title, at the end of which Levitan found himself, ran back to Mary Peterson, with H. Huffman Brown peering behind the arras of every signature. Mary Peterson to O'Rourke. Clark to Kiley, attesting witness Brown. Kiley to O'Rourke, attesting witness Brown. O'Rourke to William P. Colleton, attesting witness Brown. William P. Colleton to John Garretson, attesting witness Brown. John Garretson to Herman Bolt, attesting witness Brown. Herman Bolt to Benjamin Freeman, attesting witness Brown. Benjamin Freeman to William R. Hubert, attesting witness Brown. The assistant district attorney rubbed his forehead and wondered who in thunder all these people were. Who, for example, to begin at the beginning, was Charles A. Clark, and why should he be deeding away Ebby Peterson's property? And who were Kiley and O'Rourke, and all the rest, Colleton, Garretson, Bolt, and Freeman? And who, for that matter, was Hubert? A score of detectives were sent out to hunt up these elusive persons, but, although the directories of 20 years were searched, no Charles A. Clark, John J. Kiley, or I. F. X. O'Rourke could be discovered. Nor could anyone named Colleton, Freeman, or Hubert be found. The only persons who did appear to exist were Garretson and Bolt. Quite by chance, the assistant district attorney located the former of these, who proved to be one of Brown's clients, and who stated that he had taken title to the property at the lawyer's request and as a favor to him, did not remember from whom he had received it, had paid nothing for it, received nothing for it, and had finally deeded it to Herman Bolt at the direction of Brown. Herman Bolt, an ex-judge of the municipal court, who had been removed for misconduct in office, admitted grumblingly that while at one time he had considered purchasing the property in question, he had never actually done so, that the deed from Garretson to himself had been recorded without his knowledge or his authority, that he had paid nothing for the property and had received nothing for it, and had, at the instruction of Brown, conveyed it to Benjamin Freeman. Garretson apparently had never seen Bolt, and Bolt had never seen Freeman, while William R. Hubert, the person to whom the record showed Freeman had transferred the property, remained an invisible figure, impossible to reduce to tangibility. Just what Brown had attempted to do, had done, was obvious. In some way, being a real estate lawyer, he had stumbled upon the fact that this valuable tract of land lay unclaimed. Accordingly, he had set about the easiest way to reduce it to possession. To make assurance doubly sure, he had forged 2 chains of title, one through an assumed heir and the other through the owner herself. Then he had juggled the title through a dozen or so grantees, and stood ready to dispose of the property to the highest bidder. There he stayed in the Tombs, demanding a trial and protesting his innocence, and asserting that if the district attorney would only look long enough, he would find William R. Hubert. But an interesting question of law had cropped up to delay matters. Of course, if there was anybody by the name of Hubert who actually owned the property, and Brown had signed his name, conveying the same to a deed to Levitan, Brown was guilty of forgery in the first degree. But the evidence in the case pointed toward the conclusion that Brown himself was Hubert. If this was so, how could Brown be said to have forged the name of Hubert when he had a perfect legal right to take the property under any name he chose to assume? This was incontestable. If your name be Richard Roe, you may purchase land and receive title thereto under the name of John Doe, and convey it under that name without violating the law. This, as a general proposition, is true so long as the taking of a fictitious name is for an honest purpose and not tainted with fraud. The assistant district attorney felt that the very strength of his case created, as it were, a sort of legal weakness, for the more evidence he should put in against Brown, the clearer it would become that Hubert was merely Brown himself, and this would necessitate additional proof that Brown had taken the property in the name of Hubert for purposes of fraud, which could only be established by going into the whole history of the property. Of course, if Brown were so foolish as to put in the defense that Hubert really existed, the case would be plain sailing. If, however, Brown was as astute as the district attorney believed him to be, he might boldly admit that there was no Hubert except himself, and that in taking title to the property and disposing thereof under that name, he was committing no violation of law for which he could be prosecuted. The case was moved for trial on the 12th of March, 1906, before Judge Warren W. Foster in Part 3 of the Court of General Sessions in New York. The defendant was arraigned at the bar without counsel, owing to the absence of his lawyer through sickness, and Mr. Louis Stuyvesant Chandler, the later lieutenant governor of the state, was assigned to defend him. At this juncture Brown arose and addressed the court. In the most deferential and conciliatory manner, he urged that he was entitled to an adjournment until such time as he could produce William R. Hubert as a witness, stating that, although the latter had been in town on December 14th, and had personally given him the deeds in question, which he had handed to Levitan, Hubert's interests in the West had immediately called him from the city, and that he was then in Goldfields, Nevada, that since he had been in the Tombs, he, Brown, had been in correspondence with a gentleman by the name of Alfred Skeels, of the Teller House, Central City, Colorado, from whom he had received a letter within the week to the effect that Hubert had arranged to start immediately for New York, for the purpose of testifying as a witness for the defense. The prosecutor thereupon demanded the production of this letter from the alleged Skeels, and Brown was compelled to state that he had immediately destroyed it on its receipt. The prosecutor then argued that under those circumstances, and in view of the fact that the people's evidence showed conclusively that no such person as Hubert existed, there was no reason why the trial should not proceed then and there. The court thereupon ruled that the case should go on. A jury was procured after some difficulty, and the evidence of Mr. Levitan received, showing that Brown had represented Hubert to be a man of substance, and had produced an affidavit purported to be sworn to by Hubert to the same effect, with deeds alleged to have been signed by him. Mrs. Brayman then swore that upon the same day Brown had himself acknowledged these very deeds, and had sworn to the affidavit before her as a notary, under the name of William R. Hubert. Taken with the fact that Brown had in open court stated that Hubert was a living man, this made out a prima facie case. But, of course, the district attorney was unable to determine whether or not Brown would take the stand in his own behalf, or what his defense would be, and in order to make assurance doubly sure, offered in evidence all the deeds to the property in question, thereby establishing the fact that it was originally part of the Peterson estate, and disclosing the means whereby it had eventually been recorded in the name of Hubert. The prosecution then rested its case, and the burden shifted to the defense to explain how all these deeds, attested by Brown, came to be executed and recorded. It was indeed a difficult, if not impossible task, which the accused lawyer undertook when he went upon the stand. He again positively and vehemently denied that he had signed the name of Hubert to the deed which he had offered to Levitan, and persisted in the contention that Hubert was a real man who sooner or later would turn up. He admitted knowing the Peterson family in a casual way, and said he had done some business for them, but stated that he had not heard of their tragic death until some years after the sinking of the Geyser. He had then ascertained that no one had appeared to lay claim to Mrs. Peterson's estate, and he had accordingly taken it upon himself to advertise for heirs. In due course, Charles A. Clark had appeared, and had deeded the property to Kiley, who in turn had conveyed it to O'Rourke. Just who this mysterious O'Rourke was he could not explain, nor could he account in any satisfactory manner for the recording in 1899 of the deed signed with Mary Peterson's mark. He said that it had turned up in O'Rourke's hands after O'Rourke had become possessed of the property through the action of the heirs, and that he had no recollection of ever having seen it before, or of having witnessed it. In the latter transactions by which the property had been split up, he claimed to have acted only as attorney for the different grantors. He was unable to give the address or business of O'Rourke, Clark, Kiley, or Freeman, and admitted that he had never seen any of them save at his own office. He was equally vague as to Hubert, whose New York residence he gave as 111 Fifth Avenue. No such person, however, had ever been known at that address. Brown gave his testimony in the same dry, polite, and careful manner in which he had always been accustomed to discuss his cases and deliver his arguments. It seemed wholly impossible to believe that this respectable-looking person could be a dangerous character, yet the nature of his offence and the consequences of it were apparent when the state called to the stand an old broom-maker, who had bought from Brown one of the lots belonging to the Peterson estate. Holding up 3 stumps where fingers should have been, he cried out, choking with tears, "My friends, for 15 years I worked at making brooms, me and my wife, from 5 in the morning until 6 at night, and I lose mine fingered trying to save enough money to buy a house that we could call our own. Then, when we saved $800, this man come to us and sold us a lot. We were very happy. Yesterday another man served me mit a paper that we must leave our house because we did not own the land. We must go away. Where? We have no place to go. Our home is being taken from us, and that man," pointing his stumps at Brown, "that man has stolen it from us." He stopped, unable to speak. The defendant's lawyer properly objected, but with this piece of testimony ringing in their ears, it is hardly surprising that the jury took but 5 minutes to convict Brown of forgery in the first degree. A few days later, the judge sentenced him to 20 years in state's prison. Then other people began to wake up. The Attorney General guessed that the Peterson property had all escheated to the state. The Swedish government sent a deputy to make enquiries. The Norwegian government was sure that he was a Norwegian, and the Danish that he was a Dane. No one knows yet who is the real owner, and there are 6 heirs squatting on every corner of it. Things are much worse than before Brown tried to sell the ill-fated lot to Levitan, but a great many people who were careless before are careful now. It soon developed, however, that Lawyer Brown's industry and ingenuity had not been confined to the exploitation of the estate of Ebbe Peterson. Before the trial was well under way, the City Chamberlain of New York notified the district attorney that a peculiar incident had occurred at his office, in which not only the defendant figured, but William R. Hubert, his familiar, as well. In the year 1904, a judgment had been entered in the Supreme Court, which adjudged that a certain George Wilson was entitled to a 1/6 interest in the estate of Jane Elizabeth Barker, recently deceased. George Wilson had last been heard of 20 years before as a farmhand in Illinois, and his whereabouts were at this time unknown. Suddenly, however, he had appeared. That is to say, H. Huffman Brown had appeared as his attorney and demanded his share of the property, which had been deposited to his credit with the city chamberlain and amounted to $7,500. The lawyer had presented a petition signed apparently by Wilson, and a bond also subscribed by him, to which had been appended the names of certain sureties. One of these was a William R. Hubert, the same William R. Hubert who had mysteriously disappeared when his presence was so vital to the happiness and liberty of his creator. But the city chamberlain had not been on his guard, and had paid over the $7,500 to Brown, without ever having seen the claimant or suspecting for an instant that all was not right. It was further discovered at the same time that Brown had made several other attempts to secure legacies remaining uncalled for in the city's treasury. In how many cases he had been successful will probably never be known, but it is unlikely that his criminal career dated only from the filing of the forged Peterson deed in 1896. Brown made a heroic and picturesque fight to secure a reversal of his conviction through all the state courts, and his briefs and arguments are monuments to his ingenuity and knowledge of the law. He alleged that his conviction was entirely due to a misguided enthusiasm on the part of the prosecutor, the present writer, whom he characterized as a novelist and dreamer. The whole case, he alleged, was constructed out of the latter's fanciful imagination, a cobweb of suspicion, accusation, and falsehood. Some day his friend Hubert would come out of the West, into which he had so unfortunately disappeared, and release an innocent man sentenced practically to death because the case had fallen into the hands of one whose sense of the dramatic was greater than his logic. Perchance he will. Mayhap, when H. Huffman Brown is the oldest inmate of Sing Sing, or even sooner, some gray-haired figure will appear at the state capitol and knock tremblingly at the door of the executive, asking for a pardon or a rehearing of the case, and claiming to be the only original, genuine William R. Hubert. Such a denouement would not be beyond the realms of possibility, but more likely the request will come in the form of a petition, duly attested and authenticated before some notary in the West, protesting against Brown's conviction and incarceration, and bearing the flowing signature of William R. Hubert, the same signature that appears on Brown's deeds to Levitan, the same that is affixed to the bond of George Wilson, the vanished farmhand, claimant to the estate of Jane Elizabeth Barker. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Colleen McMahon.